You've been at some places that a lot of people would look at the
Mhm.
resume and be like, oh, like quite impressive for sure. Um, Maybe speak on the culture at Microsoft, and then maybe we'll go through the gamut up through to where you are now. But at least I know a lot of people would be curious to know how it was at Microsoft. And you were talking about your work on Iron Ruby there. Maybe talk about
Yeah,
the testing you were doing there and all that.
yeah. So at Microsoft, when I was from 2008 to 2011, I was at Microsoft. It was when Ballmer was CEO, um, and it was an interesting experience, honestly. Iron Ruby at that point in time was one of the few open source projects at Microsoft, and it was a constant fight, from what I understood, to kind of keep that alive. I would hear stories from our other teammates about having to continuously go into meetings to justify why this was a valuable project for the company to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I loved it. Like I, my responsibilities, like I said, I was the SSET on the team, so I was the tester. Um, but I was building frameworks and tooling for testing. So some of the things I did, for example, Ruby has a project called Ruby Spec, which is a executable specification for the Ruby language. And at that point in time, Iron Ruby was hot, JRuby was hot, Ruby Neos was hot, and of course Ruby was gaining popularity. It was around the 2.0 timeframe, 2019 timeframe. And so one of my first jobs was to get Iron Ruby running the Ruby Spec test suite, which was pretty straightforward, but it meant like Ruby Spec has these ways to basically say, yeah, we know that this particular feature fails for this language, so we don't run it on this language. And so I had to go through all the tests and figure out where we needed these flags, add tests as we found things that weren't quite the same, quite matching
Mm-hmm.
behavior. So I'd contribute back to the project, but then I'd make it integrate with us. And then I actually used the same test running frameworks to build a set of tests that allowed me to test C# interops. So I actually took full advantage of Ruby's flexibility. I had a little function called CSC for C# compiler, and CSC took a here doc, and then you embedded C# code in there, and you could run a script over your test suite that would pull out all of that code, compile it, like rewrite it into normal C# files, compile it, and drop the assembly in the known location. And then you ran your test suite on top of that after that, and it would run the tests against this assembly you had created. So it allowed me to have C# right next to Ruby so that my test code was next to my fixtures, if you will.
Yeah, hats
That
off
was a
for
lot of
that.
fun.
Yes,
Yeah, it was
I
a lot of
mean,
fun. It was crazy to be like, hey, okay, let's start by just like basically everything in Ruby, and then
yeah.
just re-implementing. Like I just re-enabled things like I made it yield, I made describe yield, and I made CSC gather up this code. That was basically all this little tool did. Um, so those were my testing responsibilities, and then I also was the person at that time. I owned when we migrated from SVN to GitHub. I was one of the main people doing that. I worked with the team to say, let's do this. Here's how we can do it, and
Mm-hmm.
performed it. And then when we had contributions coming in, it was a slow stream, but whenever we did have them come in, I was the person who would look over the contribution, make sure it didn't touch portions of the code that we weren't allowed to take contributions on. And then also our process there was we were part of the internal Microsoft TFS at the time. Like that was our true source of truth, source control repository.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had a public GitHub that mirrored that. And this was before TFS actually could synchronize natively with GitHub, with Git, I mean. And so I would go in and pull the contribution into TFS, make sure it passed all of our test suite, and then synchronize back outwards to keep things in sync. But it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of community interaction. I had a great team. I loved it. When I got to the JavaScript team, it was more of for me, the negative aspects of Microsoft that people would share stories of at that point in time. Very bureaucratic, very cutthroat. Very much I got mine, but you got to get your own type
Mm-hmm.
attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And
You
it
said that
wasn't the
was
best
2008 time frame?
Yeah,
Around there.
2010 is when I would have been joining the JavaScript team.
Okay. Okay.
And it wasn't a great fit for me. I'm not a huge fan of kind of that cutthroat atmosphere, honestly. I prefer collaborative environments,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't as much of that at that point in time. Um, and I wasn't personally prepared to work in that environment, so I didn't do the best in terms of managing my own expectations, managing my manager's expectations. It just wasn't really a good fit.